Greetings, class, and welcome to World History Since 1500, Lecture 1. History as a discipline studies change over time, and there have not been many moments in human history when more changed more rapidly than the second half of the 15th century, immediately preceding the period under study in this class. In Europe, the medieval period that had endured for nearly 700 years was ending for a variety of reasons. Earlier historians used to give an exact date, May 29th, 1453, as the end of the Middle Ages, the day that the Ottoman armies of Mehmed II captured Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, which had endured for a millennium after the fall of the Western Empire. Evolving historical thought now sees the effects of a complex interplay of factors, though. The weakening of the feudal nobility by the Black Death, which had decimated the peasantry upon whose labor and service the feudal system depended. Also, the Hundred Years' War had seen the first emergence of serious infantry armies in Europe since Rome, spelling doom for the mounted knights that were the backbone of feudal military forces, even if firearms hadn't been introduced. Firearms had only accelerated a process that was already well underway, as the English had demonstrated at Agincourt against the French. Finally, the schism in the Catholic Church, which had been the bedrock of near absolute religious authority and the arbiter of religious legitimacy in the Holy Roman Empire for centuries, between Rome and Avignon, each claiming to be the only legitimate pope, had undermined the Church's authority, encouraging an unprecedented degree of independence and self-determination among both national governments and individuals. There were major economic changes as well. The European peasantry that had survived the Black Death found its services in high demand, boosting their earning potential and laying the foundation for an emergent middle class. Some peasants had even gotten wealthy. They had been aided in this by the emergence of the first modern international banking industry. The availability of credit and the ability to operate across the continent promoted explosive business growth and the development of a wealthy merchant class across the continent. Before 1853, merchants had conducted a great deal of trade going through Constantinople. The fall of the city hadn't ended trade with Europe, but it had curtailed it. More important, the Silk Road, the great overland trading route that ran from Europe through Mesopotamia and Central Asia all the way to China, which had existed in some form for more than 1,500 years since before the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Empire, had been ravaged by war and carved up by empires. The Mongols, first under Genghis Khan and then Timur Shah, had destroyed many of the major Central Asian population centers along the Silk Road, such as Samarkand and Khorasan. However, the Mongols lacked the numbers to truly occupy, control, and colonize the land they conquered, leading to the rise of local kingdoms and empires that integrated Mongol culture into their own. The Ottomans controlled the terminus of the Silk Road at Constantinople, from which goods had been either sent by boat to Egypt and Italy or overland into Eastern Europe. While the road had never really closed, traversing it was dangerous and expensive, with taxes collected at every border and banditry common. An economical alternative route to the rich trade of Ming China was thus highly desirable, and one would eventually be found, with world-shaking consequences. The total effect of all this is what caused such fundamental shifts in the culture that the period after 1500 is recognized as something different from the medieval period which had preceded it, the early modern period. Its first two major highlights were global in scope, the European Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. In 1486, the philosopher Pico had composed the Oration on the Dignity of Man, the so-called Manifesto of the Renaissance. 2 years later, Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias had sailed around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa and established that the Atlantic Ocean was in fact navigable around Africa and into the Indian Ocean, and that there was thus a sea route from Europe to India and beyond to China. In addition to the financial incentive to find an alternate route to the east, the Age of Discovery also required a means to do it. By the mid-15th century, technological advances in shipbuilding and navigation in both Europe and Ming China had created the first true ocean-going ships, and they were used in different ways. In China, the Yongle Emperor had dispatched grand fleets numbering hundreds of ships across the Indian Ocean as far as the west coast of Africa. Under the command of Admiral Zheng He, these were not fleets of colonization in the European sense. Rather, they were intended to impress others with the power and wealth of Ming China, and thus make others want to enter into what would be called centuries later in another place, an empire of invitation, an empire of such power and wealth that others would want to be a part of it, rather than have to be conquered into it. This is, of course, fundamentally different from the European model of conquest and settler colonialism. In the meantime, another great civilization was spreading across northern Africa. After the disintegration of the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire had grown up around the city of Gao, then expanded to Timbuktu. Domination of the trans-Saharan gold trade enabled the Songhai Emperor to grow very fast until at its peak, the Songhai Empire was one of the largest states in African history. Gold was the basis of the economy. Until the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico, the western Sahel region of Africa was the source of approximately 80% of the world's gold. The gold trade was so thoroughly identified with this region that the coastal region of the western Sahel became known as the Gold Coast, a name which remains in use today. And gold mining remains a major industry in the Gold Coast nations of Ghana, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and indeed throughout much of the rest of Africa. While Gao remained the imperial capital of the Songhai, under the previous Mali Empire, Timbuktu had become a center of learning and culture, and following the rise of the Songhai, the university at Timbuktu became one of the finest universities in the world, combining the learning of the Islamic Empire to the north with indigenous African culture and learning and practices. And the Songhai Empire, much like the Mughal Empire in India, a Muslim elite in government ruled a majority non-Muslim population, but made it work by respecting local traditions and combining rituals in such a way that the potential for religious conflict was diffused. By 1492, the existence of a route around Africa had been known for 4 years, but no one had successfully made a trip to the east that way yet. The seas at the southern tip of Africa are the site of frequent heavy storms, and the combination of Atlantic storms and the warm Agulhas current create treacherous seas, huge waves, and extremely dangerous conditions for sailing. So it was then, in 1492, that an Italian mariner named Christopher Columbus presented an alternate plan to the King and Queen of Spain to sail due west and come to Asia from the other direction. The results of Columbus's voyage is well known: the discovery by Europeans of the continents and civilizations of the Americas, and the subsequent colonization of these lands. There are several points that should be made here. There is a persistent myth that the world was widely believed to be flat at the time of Columbus. This is untrue. In fact, educated Europeans had known since the 2nd century BCE that the world was round, especially after Eratosthenes, a librarian at the famed Library of Alexandria, had calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy. However, Columbus had miscalculated, believing that his voyage would be far shorter than the reality, which is why Columbus was facing a possible mutiny among his crew when land was sighted. Columbus had promised a lifetime stipend to the first crewman to sight land, but after the crewman who had sighted the land tried to claim the prize, Columbus answered that he himself had actually sighted the land earlier and would be keeping the stipend for himself. Nor did Columbus recognize that he had found an unexpected continental landmass. In spite of eventually making 4 separate trips to the so-called New World, Columbus went to his grave believing and arguing that he had in fact made it to Asia. This raises an interesting question. Did he thus believe that the lands and peoples he was encountering were subjects of China or another Asian power? Did Columbus believe he was risking war? And there were other Asian powers. 5 years after Columbus's first voyage, after Diaz had proved that an eastern sea route to India and China existed, Vasco da Gama became the first European to sail to India by rounding the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. Then, in 1513, another Portuguese ship following this route had been shipwrecked on the coast of a previously unknown to Europeans land, Japan. Japan was a rigidly structured feudal state ruled by a military chieftain called a shogun. The shogun commanded a warrior class of samurai who ruled the peasantry in his name, in much the same way that European knights had ruled the peasantry at the behest of the European nobility. This is critically important to understanding the significance of the Portuguese visit, for the Portuguese also introduced a technological development previously unknown in Japan: firearms. Gunpowder weapons, including firearms and primitive artillery, had been invented by the Sung Chinese during their ultimately unsuccessful war against the Mongols. The Mongols had then spread the technology west along the Silk Road as they conquered, and ultimately to Europe, where firearms and cannons were adopted by all the major powers. It was massed cannon fire that had enabled Mehmet II to break the walls protecting Constantinople in 1453 and given European musketeers the ability to kill mounted knights at a distance, further weakening the feudal nobility. It was this last characteristic that caused such trouble in Japan. Within a few decades of the introduction of firearms to Japan, Japanese musketry was the best in the world, and Japanese armies had evolved tactics for the efficient use of firearms in combat, like sequential volley fire by ranks, that would not be seen in European armies for another century. Firearms quickly became the dominant weapon. With Japan bogged down in a land war in Korea and facing a massive Chinese intervention, one Japanese nobleman wrote home begging for more muskets, saying, quote, "There is absolutely no use for swords or spears." Then, something almost unique in history happened. The structure of Japanese society depended on a monopoly on the use of force by the samurai, yet firearms gave the lowliest peasant the ability to kill a samurai at a distance, thereby threatening the entire social order of Japan. The Japanese government thus then introduced a licensing regime. Firearms could only be produced under license, and the only licenses approved were for government purchases. As work dried up, firearms makers turned to the manufacture of swords, knives, and other melee weapons, and within a century, firearms had practically disappeared from Japan. It is one of the most unusual moments in all of modern history. Japan looked down the road where firearms were taking them, decided they didn't like what they saw, and simply turned away. When the Americans arrived in Japan in 1854, they found a perfectly preserved feudal society in which edged weapons in the hands of the samurai ruled absolutely over the peasantry in the name of the shogun. Superior weaponry played a critical role in the colonization of the Americas as well. Columbus had noted that the Taino natives he had encountered had no edged weapons and did not even recognize what a sword was, leading him to boast in his diaries that with 50 men he could conquer the entire place and make the population do whatever he wanted. Spanish colonizers, secure in their unchallengeable military superiority, then conducted a reign of almost indescribable brutality. While natives with no immunity to European diseases died by the millions, as recorded in the diaries of Spanish cleric Bartolomé de las Casas, Spanish colonizers murdered, starved, enslaved, and worked to death countless thousands of natives, a pattern that continued when Spanish explorers hit the mainland on Central America and encountered the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire was a rich source of gold that became the origin source of the Spanish treasure fleets that were the favored target of classical era pirates, and so many of which wound up on the bottom of the sea in the waters of the Caribbean and the Straits of Florida, where they are still sought and occasionally found today by treasure hunters, like famed Florida treasure hunter Mel Fisher. No one knows how many natives died in the colonization of the Caribbean and Mesoamerica, but it is safe to estimate tens of millions from disease and abuse. By 1520, approximately 90% of the natives were dead, a die-off of such scale that historians refer to it as the Great Dying. This would set the pattern for the next 300 years of European colonization of the Americas, in which numerically superior native tribes would first be decimated by disease, then overwhelmed and killed or subjugated by Europeans with superior weapons. From the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico, the Spanish expanded in both directions, with the conquistador Pizarro moving south into continental South America and conquering the vast Inca Empire, which ran most of the length of the west coast of South America, and Coronado moving north into the modern-day western United States, as far northwest as Oregon and east to the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto landed in Florida and moved west, giving Spain control of most of the southern coast of North America. Within a few decades, the Spanish had built an empire in the Americas of a size unseen since the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan centuries earlier. The next steps in European colonization of the Americas were close behind. French explorers traveled both the St. Lawrence River, opening Canada, and the Mississippi River, connecting the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes and the French holdings in Canada. At the same time, in 1607, English settlers, after earlier failures, established Jamestown, the first successful English colony on the North American mainland, on the James River in present-day Virginia.